some of its blood toward the front of the tent of meeting 7 times. And the heifer shall be burned in his sight, its skin, its flesh, and blood, and its dung, and shall be burned. And the priest shall take cedar wood, and hyssop, and scarlet yarn, scarlet wool, and throw them into the fire with the burning heifer. Then the priest shall wash his clothes, bathe his body in water, and afterward he may come into the camp, but the priest shall be unclean until evening. The one who burns the heifer shall wash his clothes in water, and bathe his body in water, and shall be unclean until evening. And a man who is clean shall gather up the ashes of the heifer, and deposit them outside the camp in a clean place. And they shall be kept for the water of impurity, the water for impurity for the congregation of the people of Israel. It is a sin offering. And the one who gathers the ashes of the heifer shall wash his clothes and be unclean until evening. It shall be a perpetual this shall be a perpetual statute for the people of Israel and for the stranger who sojourns among them. I read that through real quick. Let me explain what's happened. God says to Moses, tell Aaron, the high priest, that I want you to find a red heifer who is spotless and who is completely red and who has never had a yoke upon itself. Without defect, completely spotless, and never has a yoke upon itself. Those were the 3 criteria. This red heifer couldn't have anything that wasn't red. Its hooves had to be red. All its hair had to be red. The priests and the rabbis would look over it. If there were 2 hairs on this heifer's body that were not red, usually they were black or white, the heifer was disqualified. The reality is this animal was almost non-existent. This creature, a completely spotless, blemishless heifer, was impossible to come by. And so God had this standard. And then He said there could be no yoke upon this animal, that this animal could have never done any work except be tied up. Something that would save it. But couldn't carry anything. Nobody could ride it. Now, a heifer is a female cow. It's not a very pretty looking animal. But it's what God chose for this substitution, for this sin offering. This heifer was to be completely burned. All the animal sacrifices, this is actually the only animal sacrifice that the whole entire animal gets completely burned. And it gets burned with scarlet wool, with cedar, and with hyssop. Now, scarlet wool represents the sin. It's rough. And it represents the sin that we do, the obvious sin, the blatant ones, the things that, hey, you can't argue about. Yeah, I did those. And so scarlet wool represents the sin. So the priests were to throw the sin in with the animal, the scarlet wool. Not only were they to do that, but they would throw cedar and hyssop. Now, cedar was like the strongest of woods, and hyssop was like the flimsiest of branches. And cedar represented the intellect, the wise, the understanding, all that was strong about our natural life. And the hyssop represented all that was, emotional and all that was, all that just kind of went with the wind, you know, the stuff in our lives that is just maybe peculiar or romantic in nature or just kind of even weak per se. And so God commanded them to throw the cedar and the hyssop in with the fire. And that this was to be taken outside the camp and slaughtered before the priest. Completely burned, completely consumed. Everything, including the intestines of the animal, which usually weren't burned. And as a result, the priest was to... It's interesting that what happens here is that the animal who is clean, right? Who is clean. The Scriptures tell us this animal who is clean, the priest that burns the animal becomes unclean for a small season. The priest that burns the animal becomes unclean. But yet, the animal what you're supposed to do is take all of its ashes, and you're supposed to put it in a spring of water, living water, spring water, and you're supposed to mix it. And the ashes were to rest on top of the water, and a hyssop branch was to be taken. First, the priest took the blood of the animal, right? And he sprinkles it on the tent of the meeting, which means it's complete 7 times. By sprinkling it 7 times, it symbolizes that this offering is acceptable to God, that it satisfies God's requirements that He set up. And not only does He sprinkle that 7 times, but He mixes the ashes with the water, and anybody who is unclean, the hyssop branch is dipped into the water with the ashes of the heifer, and they're sprinkled. Okay? Probably just like a priest that we see these days would do. They'd sprinkle the person with the water. Okay? And let's look at why they would become unclean. There's basically 3 reasons. The first reason, verse 11. Whoever touches the dead body of any person shall be unclean for 7 days. So if you touched a body of a dead person, you were unclean for 7 days. And you had to go through this ritual of becoming cleansed through the ashes and the water of the heifer. But if you didn't, you'd remain unclean. You'd remain unclean. He shall cleanse himself with the water on the 3rd day and on the 7th day, and so be clean. But if he does not cleanse himself on the 3rd day and the 7th day, he will not become clean. Whoever touches a dead person, the body of anyone who has died, and does not cleanse himself, listen to this, defiles the tabernacle of the Lord, and that person shall be cut off from Israel, because the water for impurity was not thrown on him, and he shall be unclean. His uncleanness is still on him. A person who touches the dead body defiles the temple of the Lord. You cannot enter the temple. You cannot go there. The Jews still believe this today. The temple of the Lord, they believe, right, is under the Dome of the Rock, where the Muslims have their dome. You've seen it? Big gold thing. That's where all the wars are going on. Okay? Jewish people do not go there. Not because it's a Muslim temple, but because they are unclean. Because the Jewish people are still waiting for the red heifer. Matter of fact, in 1997, there was a heifer named Molly. C&MA has an article on it. Some Texas people and some Jewish people were trying to breed a heifer that was pure, red, and spotless, without blemish, without a yoke upon it, and they thought they had it. Matter of fact, CNN and everybody else reports that if this was truly a red heifer, without spotless, without blemish, that everything on it was red, watch out, world. Because it would mean that the Jews now could burn this, get the ashes they needed, mix it with water, and sprinkle themselves, because right now they consider themselves unclean, and sprinkle each other and enter the area of the Dome of the Rock, which is to them the most sacred place, the tabernacle of the Lord. Because they're not willing to defile it, because they know they're unclean. And so they would go, and folks, everything I read would say all hell would break loose, possibly. Because there would be just every reason to war and battle, and forget about terrorist bombings. They would move in. I don't know exactly what they do. I'm not a Jewish scholar, okay? I'm an Italian scholar. So you're getting as limited today, all right? But what happened was that these kosher rabbis, amazingly so, these kosher rabbis looked at the heifer, and after a while, it grew like 3 black hairs. And they said, oh, it's no good. Now, Italians would say, let's tweeze them. That's the Italian way. We got the heifer. Let's spray paint the sucker, you know? But no, Jews, they're going to do it right. It's not kosher, you know? 2004, another one is born and bred in this environment. And the goal, and again, 2 white hairs show up. A couple white hairs show up. And it's no longer valid. So I wanted to bring this to you today because, like, there are a group, a nation, millions of people waiting for the heifer.